What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved stars completely loses it on live television? Tonight, we're diving into the explosive confrontation that had security rushing onto the set of The Late Show. Cameras still rolling as Danny DeVito stormed off stage after a heated exchange that nobody saw coming. This wasn't your typical celebrity interview gone wrong. This was something much deeper, much more personal. And it all started with one seemingly innocent question that touched a nerve nobody knew existed. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think really happened here. Because trust me, there's more to this than meets the eye. The Late Show set was buzzing with its usual pre-show energy. Danny DeVito had just settled into the guest chair, his characteristic grin lighting up his face as he adjusted the microphone clip to his shirt. The audience was already warmed up, clearly excited to see the legendary actor who had brought so much joy to their screens over the decades. Stephen Colbert, ever the professional host, was flipping through his note cards one final time, seemingly preparing for what should have been a routine promotional interview for DeVito's latest project. "Danny, it's great to have you back on." The show Colbert began with his trademark smile, the studio lights creating that perfect late-night television ambience. "You know, I was just talking to my producers backstage, and we were reminiscing about some of your most iconic roles. Taxi, It's Always Sunny, Batman Returns, the list goes on and on." DeVito chuckled, settling back into his chair with the comfort of someone who had done thousands of these interviews over his long career. "Well, Stephen, you know me, I just try to bring a little chaos wherever I go. Keeps things interesting, right?" The audience laughed appreciatively, and Colbert nodded along. "That's exactly what I wanted to talk about, actually. Your ability to bring this incredible energy to every character you play. But I have to ask, and our viewers are probably wondering this too, do you ever worry about being typecast? I mean, you've played so many memorable villains and, let's be honest, morally questionable characters over the years." Something subtle shifted in DeVito's expression. The easy smile remained, but there was a flicker of something else behind his eyes. "Typecast? I don't know about that, Stephen. I think I've had a pretty diverse career, wouldn't you say?" Colbert, not picking up on the slight tension, pressed forward with what he probably thought was harmless banter. "Oh, absolutely. But come on, you have to admit, there's a pattern here. The Penguin, Frank Reynolds, even going back to Louis De Palma in Taxi. These are characters that audiences love to hate, or at least they're not exactly the heroes of their stories." DeVito's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You know what, Stephen? I think you might be oversimplifying things a bit there. These characters, they're complex, they have depth, they have reasons for being the way they are. Just because someone isn't conventionally likable doesn't mean they don't have value, or that the actor playing them should be reduced to some kind of cartoon villain category." The studio audience was still engaged, many probably thinking this was just an interesting discussion about acting and character development. Colbert, however, seemed to sense that he had touched on something, but wasn't quite sure what it was. He decided to pivot slightly, but unfortunately, he chose exactly the wrong direction. Right, of course. I didn't mean to suggest your characters lack complexity. It's just that, well, let's be real here, Danny. A lot of your most memorable performances involve characters who are, how should I put this delicately, physically imposing through their presence rather than their stature. I mean, you've made a career out of proving that dynamite comes in small packages, haven't you? The change in DeVito's demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. His entire body language shifted, his shoulders squared, and his voice dropped to a dangerously low register. Physically imposing through their presence rather than their stature. What exactly are you trying to say here, Stephen? Colbert, realizing he had made a mistake, but not fully understanding the magnitude of it, attempted to backtrack. I just meant that you've never let your height define your performances. You've always commanded the screen, regardless of physical limitations, and I think that's admirable. Physical limitations. DeVito's voice was now carrying an edge that was making everyone in the studio uncomfortable. Let me get this straight. You invite me on your show, and within the first 5 minutes, you've managed to call me a typecast. Villain actor with physical limitations, who makes up for his lack of stature through loud, obnoxious characters. Is that about right? The audience was starting to sense that this wasn't scripted banter anymore. There was a palpable tension in the air, and Colbert's usual confidence was beginning to crack. "Danny, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Here I was trying to compliment your versatility as an actor." "Compliment?" DeVito leaned forward in his chair, his eyes locked onto Colbert's. "You want to compliment me? How about acknowledging that I've been working in this industry for over 50 years, that I've directed films, produced dozens of projects, founded a production company, and have been nominated for and won multiple awards for my work, both in front of and behind the camera. But instead, you want to talk about how I've overcome my physical limitations to play memorable villains." Colbert was clearly flustered now, sweat beginning to form on his brow as he realized the interview was spiraling completely out of his control. "Danny, please, I think we're having a communication breakdown here. Maybe we should start over, talk about your new project." "Oh, we're having a communication breakdown, all right," DeVito shot back, his voice rising slightly. "The breakdown is that you apparently did zero research before having me on your show. You reduced my entire career to a handful of stereotypes, and then had the nerve to frame it as some kind of inspirational story about overcoming adversity. Do you have any idea how insulting that is?" The studio had fallen into an uncomfortable silence. You could hear the hum of the cameras, the subtle shuffle of audience members shifting in their seats, and the barely audible whispers of producers offstage trying to figure out how to salvage what was quickly becoming a disaster. Colbert's hands were fidgeting with his note cards, and his usual quick wit seemed to have completely abandoned him. "Danny, I sincerely apologize if I've offended you," Colbert said, his voice carefully measured. "That was never my intention. I have nothing but respect for your body of work and your contributions to the entertainment industry." DeVito wasn't buying it. He sat back in his chair, but his posture remained rigid, confrontational. "Your intention doesn't really matter here, Stephen. What matters is that you clearly came into this interview with a preconceived notion of who I am and what my career represents. And you couldn't be bothered to look beyond the surface-level stereotypes." "I don't think that's fair," Colbert replied. And immediately, everyone in the studio could sense that he had just made another crucial mistake. Telling an already angry guest that their feelings aren't fair was probably not the wisest choice. DeVito's eyes flashed with renewed anger. "Oh, I'm being unfair now. Let me ask you something, Stephen. When you have actors like Tom Cruise or Brad Pitt on this show, do you spend the first 10 minutes of the interview talking about how they've overcome the tremendous disadvantage of being conventionally attractive? Do you analyze their career through the lens of how they've compensated for their physical attributes?" Colbert opened his mouth to respond, but DeVito wasn't finished. "Or how about this? When you interview female actors, do you immediately jump into discussions about how they've been typecast based on their appearance, and then frame it as some kind of inspiring story about overcoming obstacles?" "That's different, Danny, and you know it," Colbert said, his own frustration starting to show. "I was trying to highlight your talent, your ability to create these larger-than-life characters despite the fact that Hollywood doesn't always make it easy for actors who don't fit the traditional leading man mold." The audience gasped audibly at this response. Even people who weren't entertainment industry insiders could tell that Colbert had just dug himself into an even deeper hole. DeVito's face went through a range of emotions, from shock to disbelief to pure fury. Despite the fact that Hollywood doesn't make it easy for actors who don't fit the traditional leading man mold, DeVito repeated slowly, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "Are you listening to yourself right now, Stephen? Do you hear what you're saying to me?" Colbert realized he had made yet another mistake, but at this point, he seemed committed to defending his position rather than backing down. "I'm saying that the industry has certain standards and expectations, and you've managed to build an incredible career by working within and around those limitations. I think that's admirable." "Working around those limitations," DeVito said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Unbelievable." "You know what, Stephen? Let me educate you about something. I didn't build my career by working around limitations. I built my career by being good at what I do. I built it by creating memorable characters, by understanding human nature, by bringing depth and authenticity to every role I take on." The tension in the studio was now so thick you could cut it with a knife. Camera operators were glancing nervously at their producers, wondering if they should keep rolling or cut away. The audience was completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. DeVito continued, his voice growing stronger and more passionate. You want to know what the real limitation is here? It's people like you, people who can't see past physical appearance to recognize actual talent and craftsmanship. You've reduced my entire body of work to some kind of inspirational story about a short guy who made it in Hollywood despite his disadvantages. I never said anything about your height being a disadvantage, Colbert protested, but his voice lacked conviction. You didn't have to say it explicitly, DeVito fired back. It was implied in every single question you've asked me tonight. Physically imposing through presence rather than stature, overcoming physical limitations, working around industry standards. Every single comment has been a backhanded way of saying that my success is surprising given my appearance. Colbert was clearly feeling cornered now, and instead of de-escalating, he made the decision to push back. Danny, I think you're being overly sensitive here. This is late-night television. We make jokes, we have fun, we don't take everything so seriously. The words hung in the air for a moment, and then DeVito slowly leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Overly sensitive? Did you just tell me that I'm being overly sensitive about decades of dealing with exactly this kind of thoughtless, productive commentary about my career and my person? I'm just saying that maybe we're making this bigger than it needs to be. Colbert replied, but even as the words left his mouth, he seemed to realize how inadequate they sounded. DeVito stood up abruptly, the sudden movement causing his chair to roll backward several feet. The audience collectively held its breath. You know what, Stephen? You're absolutely right. I am making this bigger than it needs to be, because clearly, having a thoughtful, respectful conversation with you about my work and my craft is expecting too much. Danny, please sit down. Let's talk about this like adults, Colbert said, but there was a pleading quality to his voice now that made it clear he had completely lost control of the situation. Like adults, DeVito repeated, his voice rising again. Adults don't invite guests onto their show and then spend the entire time making thinly veiled comments about their physical appearance. Adults don't dismiss legitimate concerns as being overly sensitive. Adults don't reduce 50 years of professional work to a series of stereotypes and then act surprised when someone takes offense. The studio was in complete chaos now. Producers were frantically gesturing from offstage. Audience members were whispering among themselves, and Colbert looked like he wanted nothing more than to disappear into his chair. But DeVito wasn't done yet. Standing behind his chair, DeVito continued his verbal assault with the precision of someone who had clearly been holding back years of frustration. You know what the really pathetic part is, Stephen? You probably think you're being progressive, enlightened even by having me on your show and talking about how I've overcome adversity. But what you're actually doing is perpetuating the same tired, shallow thinking that has plagued this industry for decades. Colbert made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. Danny, I understand you're upset, but we have an audience here. We're on television. Can we please just take this down a notch and have a civilized discussion? Civilized? DeVito's voice cracked with incredulous laughter. You want to talk about civilized? What's civilized about inviting someone onto your show under the pretense of promoting their work and then spending the entire time making them defend their right to exist in their chosen profession without being reduced to a series of physical characteristics? The camera operators were now getting clear signals from the control room to keep rolling. This was television gold, even if it was completely unscripted and spiraling out of control. The audience was transfixed. Many of them had their phones out, clearly recording what they sensed was going to be a viral moment. I never questioned your right to exist in this profession, Colbert said weakly. You're putting words in my mouth. Am I? DeVito shot back. Because every single question you've asked tonight has been premised on the assumption that my success is somehow anomalous, that I've had to work harder or be more creative or compensate for something in order to achieve what I've achieved. That's not celebrating my work, Stephen. That's othering me. Colbert's face was flushed now. Whether from embarrassment or anger, it was hard to tell. Look, Danny, I think you're misinterpreting everything I've said tonight. I was trying to have a fun, lighthearted conversation about your career, and somehow you've turned this into some kind of political statement about representation in Hollywood. That was the moment when DeVito completely lost it. His voice rose to a level that had never been heard on the normally controlled Late Show set. Political statement. You think this is political? This is personal, Stephen. This is about basic human decency and respect. He began gesturing wildly with his hands, his entire body language screaming frustration and anger. For 50 years, I have had to listen to people like you make comments about my appearance, my stature, my physical presence, always couched in terms of how remarkable it is that I've managed to succeed despite these supposed handicaps, and I am sick of it. The studio audience was now completely silent, many of them looking genuinely uncomfortable with how intense the situation had become. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This felt like witnessing something private and painful being played out. In public, Colbert stood up as well now, perhaps thinking that would help him regain some authority in the situation. Danny, you're shouting. This is getting out of hand. Maybe we should take a commercial break. Don't you dare try to manage me right now, DeVito snapped, pointing directly at Colbert. You created this mess with your thoughtless questions, and your inability to see me as anything other than a curiosity. You don't get to control how I respond to your insults. I never insulted you, Colbert protested, but his voice was getting higher and more defensive. Everything I said was meant as a compliment to your talent and your resilience. DeVito stepped closer to Colbert's desk, his movements sharp and aggressive. Resilience? There's that word again. You know what would actually be resilient, Stephen? If I just sat here and smiled and played along with your condescending line of questioning like I've done 1,000 times before with 1,000 other hosts who think exactly like you do. At this point, several producers had emerged from the wings, clearly trying to figure out how to intervene without making the situation worse. The head of security was standing just off camera, ready to step in if things escalated further. But I'm not going to do that anymore, DeVito continued, his voice now carrying a weight that made everyone in the studio pay attention. I'm not going to sit here and let you or anyone else reduce my life's work to some kind of feel-good story about overcoming physical limitations. My work speaks for itself, and if you can't see that, if all you can see when you look at me is someone who doesn't fit your narrow definition of what an actor should look like, then that says a lot more about you than it does about me. Colbert, clearly desperate at this point, made one final attempt to salvage the situation. Danny, please, I respect your work immensely. I think there's been a huge misunderstanding here. Can we please start over? DeVito stared at him for a long moment, and for just an instant, it seemed like he might actually consider it. But then he shook his head slowly, his expression a mixture of disappointment and disgust. No, Stephen, we can't start over, because this isn't a misunderstanding. This is exactly what I thought it was from the moment I sat down in this chair. This is you showing me and everyone watching exactly how you really see me. And probably how you see a lot of other people who don't fit into your comfortable, predictable categories. He started to remove his microphone, his movements deliberate. And final, you know what? I don't need this. I don't need to sit here and be patronized by someone who thinks they're doing me a favor by having me on their show to talk about how inspirational it is that I've managed to have a career despite being short. Danny, you're being unreasonable, Colbert said. And immediately everyone in the studio could see that he had just made the biggest mistake of the entire evening. DeVito froze, the microphone halfway off his shirt. He slowly looked up at Colbert, and when he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. I'm being unreasonable. After everything that's happened here tonight, after every condescending question, after every backhanded compliment, after dismissing my concerns as being overly sensitive, now I'm being unreasonable for standing up for myself. He yanked the microphone completely off and threw it down on the chair. You know what, Stephen? This interview is over. As DeVito started walking toward the edge of the stage, Colbert called after him. Danny, come on. Don't walk out like this. We can work this out. DeVito stopped and turned around one final time. Work this out. The only thing to work out here is why you thought any of this was acceptable in the first place. He gestured broadly at the studio, the audience, the cameras. This whole thing has been a masterclass in how not to interview someone, and I'm not going to stand here and pretend otherwise just to make your show look good. At that point, as DeVito headed for the stage exit, security finally stepped in, not to stop him, but to escort him safely off the set as producers frantically tried to figure out how to end the segment. The audience sat in stunned silence as the cameras finally cut away, leaving everyone to process what they had just witnessed. What started as a routine promotional interview had turned into one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history, all because of a series of thoughtless questions that revealed much more about the host than the guest. This wasn't just a celebrity having a bad day. This was a master craftsman defending his legacy against decades of reductive stereotyping, and he wasn't backing down. So, what do you think really happened here? Was DeVito overreacting to innocent questions, or was Colbert completely out of line with his approach to the interview? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more incredible stories like this one. Because trust me, Hollywood has plenty more where. This came from